All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into the source material on one of the most brutal and, honestly, transformative periods in all of history, the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin. We're going to look at how a nation was hammered into a superpower and the absolutely terrible price that was paid for that power.
So let's start with this quote right here, which really sets the stage for everything that follows. Stalin said this in 1931, and you can just feel the urgency, right? We are 50 to 100 years behind. We must make up this distance in 10 years. Either we do this or they crush us. I mean, wow. This wasn't just some political speech. For him, this was a life-or-death situation for the entire country.
Okay, so that brings us to our first section, a race against time. You have to picture the USSR in the late 1920s. It was this huge, mostly agricultural nation, kind of isolated and surrounded by powerful industrial countries that were, let's just say, not friendly. I mean, can you even imagine that kind of pressure? The leadership truly believed they had a single decade, just 10 years, to close a gap that took other countries a century to build. And if they failed, annihilation. This wasn't about tweaking the economy. It was a frantic, do-or-die sprint for survival.
So how do you even begin to do that? Well, this leads us to Section 2, Forging a Superpower. The answer was a massive, and I mean brutal, two-part plan to completely remake the nation from the ground up.
And here's the blueprint. It was pretty straightforward, really. Part 1, rapid industrialization. The government would plan and build a massive industrial base. We're talking factories, mines, power plants, the whole shebang, through these things called the 5-year plans. Part 2, collectivization. This meant taking control of all the farms, forcing peasants onto them so the state could control all the food. Why? To feed the new factory workers and to sell grain abroad to pay for all that industrial machinery.
And just look at these numbers from the first 5-year plan. The results, at least on paper, were absolutely staggering. Pig iron production nearly doubled. Coal almost doubled. And iron ore production, it more than tripled. You can see it right here. Statistically speaking, the country was transforming at a speed that was just unheard of.
Meanwhile, out in the countryside, the change was just as massive. Think about this. By 1936, 90% of all farmland had been forcibly taken over by the state. A way of life that had existed for centuries, private farming, was basically wiped out in less than a decade. The state now controlled the food.
But, and this is a huge but, those numbers on the charts don't tell you the whole story. Not even close. So now we have to turn to Section 3, the unfathomable cost. This is where we look at the horrific human reality behind all those statistics.
And this is where it gets really, really dark. Look at this number. In just 2 years, from 1936 to 1938, during what's known as the Great Purge, the state executed somewhere between 700,000 and 1.2 million of its own citizens. Let that sink in. That's not a typo. That's the estimated number of people killed in just 2 years.
The source material paints a picture of a society that was basically under siege from its own government. You had millions of people in the Gulag used as slave labor on huge construction projects. You had devastating famines, partly because peasants were protesting by killing their own animals. The laws were incredibly harsh. Show up 20 minutes late for work, you could be fired, lose your home, lose your food. And then there was the sheer terror. Mass arrests, torture, it was just a part of life. And entire groups like the kulaks, who were basically just slightly more successful farmers, were targeted for execution or deportation.
And at the same time, this was the official picture the state was painting. This is a real postage stamp from 1950. Look at the banner above the smiling kids. It says, "Thank you, dear Stalin, for our happy childhood." When you put that image next to the reality of the gulags and the famines, I mean, the contrast is just absolutely chilling. It's surreal.
So, you have to ask, why? Why would a government do this to its own people? Was it just madness, or was there some kind of logic behind it, however twisted? Well, that brings us to Section 4, where one of our sources offers a theory to help us make sense of it.
And here's the really big question the source material pushes us to consider. Was what happened in the Soviet Union a one-off? Was it something unique to its specific system? Or, and this is the uncomfortable part, does it actually reveal something more universal about how all states act when they think they're in danger?
So here's the theory. One of our sources puts forward this idea that, look,
When a state feels its very existence is threatened, by enemies inside or out, it will use repression to survive. And it doesn't matter what the ideology is, communist, capitalist, whatever. The argument is that this is just what states do when their backs are against the wall.
Now this is really interesting. The source then draws these parallels to make its case. On the left, you see the Soviet targets, kulaks, Trotskyites, and so on. On the right, it lists examples from U.S. history, loyalists during the Revolution, suspected communists during the Cold War. The point the source is making is that while the names and labels for the enemy within change, the basic impulse of the state to identify and crush those threats, well, that impulse is disturbingly consistent.
And all of this leads us to the final section, and it's a complicated one, Stalin's contradictory legacy. The subtitle really says it all, a victory bathed in blood. Because here's the thing, and it's a really difficult thing to grapple with. The plan, as brutal as it was, actually worked. The USSR did it. It went from a backwater agrarian nation to a modern industrial superpower in about a decade. It fundamentally changed its position on the world stage.
And that new industrial power was put to the ultimate test just a few years later in World War II. The sources are pretty clear on this. That industrial base was absolutely essential for defeating Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union took the brunt of the Nazi war machine. But look at that number. An estimated 26.6 million Soviets died in that war. That's a scale of loss that is just almost impossible to grasp.
So this table really just lays it all out, this incredible paradox. On one side, the achievement. They transformed into a superpower. On the other, the price. Millions dead from famine and purges. They built a military that defeated the Nazis, but at the price of a society completely traumatized by terror. They became a global superpower, but with a legacy where you simply cannot separate the national triumph from the mass human suffering. They are two sides of the same coin.
Which leaves us with the final, really unsettling question that all of this source material points to. What is the acceptable price for progress, for power? When a country believes it's in a fight for its very survival, are there any limits? It's a question without an easy answer.